Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 7th of July. In today's update, we're looking at the Russian intensification across a broad part of the front line of attacks, basically along the Zaporizhzhia, a lot of contact. We're going to look at developments on the ground and reporting from a Ukrainian battalion commander. We're also going to look at developments along the southern Donetsk front because we have the closing of the bloated salient east of the Myrnohrad River, which has been covered on the channel for several days now. We're also going to look at the Ukrainian re-entrance into Dakhny in Dnipro Oblast. We're going to finish off by zooming in on developments east of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, because now we have footage of the Russians entering into two villages via a two-pronged attack, aiming to overrun the vanguard, meant to protect one of the defense lines that is essentially acting as a perimeter for the cluster of cities that includes those two key areas being Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk. We'll look at the elevation there as well. So let's zoom in and really deep dive into what's going on in Zaporizhzhia. So just recently, this battalion commander that was interviewed, his call sign is Forest. He explained what's going on and how the Russian forces are now intensifying their attacks, really starting from Kamyansket, which is obviously on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, and moving all the way eastwards, I would say, to where you have Biluhiria. So if you're measuring just generally how much that spans, it's about 60 kilometers. And in all fairness, we also have this other section where there's recently been a lot of movement, and that is Malanivka, which is a bit further eastwards, and actually in some ways could be connected to movements occurring in southern Donetsk, but that's a bit more peripheral to this discussion. We're more so looking at the area from the Orkiv sector all the way to the coastal sector. So this region has endured a lot of upticks in Russian FPV strikes, reconnaissance UAVs being spotted in the air, and the Ukrainians are involved in trying to intercept them on a daily basis. We're also seeing an increase in artillery strikes and daily ground maneuvers. So what he's noted is that you have forces of between 3 to 4 men that are conducting attacks either with no heavy equipment or utilizing buggies, ATVs, motorcycles, and the like. 65th Brigade is one of the most critical Ukrainian units that is defending across the Zaporizhzhia front, but its main theater of operations is directly south of Orkiv. It played a huge role in dragging in the fighting in Robotyne, and that was a year and a half ago, and they've been involved in the aftermath, trying to defend the fields that are northeast of it. So they're still active around here despite all this time passing and really not receiving any sort of reprieve. But they were able to cope with it because the intensity of fighting over here throughout the beginning of 2025 wasn't that significant. But in recent months, they have noticed that there has been such an uptick, and now they're reporting on it. So you do have those small squads that are beginning to infiltrate the line, and actual infiltrations along this current line of contact aren't extremely difficult. The fact of the matter is the Russian forces don't have a significant amount of forces deployed that would be enough for a large aero offensive in the same way that we see across 3 sectors right now, and perhaps 4 if we're going to add in what's going on west of the Oskil River, the sort that we've seen in Sumy, which is recently stabilized, and what we're seeing currently unfold in southern Donetsk towards the Vavcha and Mokryali rivers, and also Pokrovsk, which we'll get into later on in this video, where we're also seeing a lot of Russian movement. So that sort of commitment, it hasn't been really noticed here yet. But the commander of this battalion in the brigade did know that there has been a buildup in Russian forces recently. So that could play a role. I do believe that the 247th Air Assault Regiment, their deployment recently and their reemergence as a key unit that's fighting for Russia along this part of the front line will play a role in leading any future assaults. And I do think that now the Russians have sensed there is an opportunity and they will try to uptake assaults. But I do think that the scale, unless we get some sort of further corroboration based on footage or based on Russian statements, I don't think we can say that it's really comparable to what we're seeing across other sections of the front line that are more intense. But in any case, we do still see that there are positional advances. So Ukrainian sources now, for the first time, are beginning to admit that Lobkove and Stepove are fully under Russian control. I've already marked Lobkove as being under full Russian hands for a while now, and the same sort of confirmation has now come from Stepove. In the process, we see that about 3 square kilometers of territory was captured. This is once again easy because you're looking at large swaths of open areas. So you don't have that many Ukrainian forces deployed to the line of contact. And more generally, the Ukrainian troop disposition over here is both more scarce than key parts of the front line, and it's also lower in quality. So that plays a role in decreasing the efficacy of the defensive activities. I suppose the upside for the Ukrainians would be the fact that this area is so open that you have this region spanning nearly 6 kilometers between the trenches in the line of contact does give a lot of free reign for drones to attack those small groups and pick them off. But there is also a lot of forestry in this area, a lot of hedgerows, and they have not been destroyed. There's still a lot of foliage and a lot of dugouts within those tree lines, which serves as the perfect concealment for small squads and makes it difficult to pick them out, especially at night. So they are using that to their advantage over here. And the Russians, they noticed that you have this 6 kilometer gap and then a extensive line, one that was prepared well and continues to be built upon even now. So we're continuing to see, new layers being built, anti-tank ditches being added, I suppose dragon's teeth and trenches as well. You have barbed wire at the forefront of a lot of these new Ukrainian defenses that have been set up. And I would expect that given the open area, there's also going to be a lot of minefields. That's something we also saw in 2023, 2 years ago now, in the counteroffensive. So this area was probably also littered with minefields. So there's going to need to be an effort to bring in those mine clearers to remotely do it or actually do it directly using a vehicle. So that's going to be a part of it. But for the most part, we're not looking at heavy weaponry being utilized over here. I haven't seen an armored assault by the Russian side along this part of the front line in a while. I suppose the last time they did it might have been around Malatokmachka and Bilohiria. There was a positional advance like 2 or 3 weeks ago that allowed the Russians to push a bit northwards towards the Conquer River over here, but it never really materialized past that. But just to go back to what the commander of that battalion was saying, he alleges that Russia's objectives over here are, first of all, to cut off the highway that you referred to as the Mariupol highway. I don't really understand what he meant by that, but you can see over here there is a highway that branches out of Mariupol, passes through all of these Russian-controlled territories in Zaporizhzhia, and then through Orkiv all the way into Zaporizhzhia itself. And so this highway over here does still serve the function of crossing through the key logistics point, Kamyshuvaka, and then from there dispersing towards various outlets along the front line. So it's about 17 kilometers away from the line of contact right now. And yes, it is an important road network for the Ukrainians, not just the highway, but also all of the paved roads that branch out of it. So that's something to keep in mind. He also said that the Russians are looking at finally closing in on Orkiv. And Orkiv is, it's a complicated area. It's overrun, but certainly it would play a big role in undermining Ukraine's integrity, defensive integrity in this region, because it would allow them to massively breach the first line of defenses over here in Zaporozhye and take over a large town that's been used as sort of the nexus, the main linchpin for Ukrainian defensive activities over here. So taking it over would play a big role in also getting access to the road networks that then branch out towards the rear line of defense over here. And that would also run along the highway into Zaporozhye. So again, Orkiv, really important objective for the Russians, and you can see how the advances that occurred earlier on this year, it was actually in March and then maybe in April, where they captured this section of the highway. It actually gives them the opportunity later on to push eastwards along the section of the highway, cross over the trenches, which will be difficult, and at that point, they're able to enter into the city itself. And the city is complicated for both sides, actually, once there would actually be some sort of urban battle because of the bodies of water and the low-lying floodplains that bisect much of the town. So that will complicate the situation and actually cause it to resemble Velika Novosilka in a certain way. So with all that being said, he also mentioned that the Russian forces want to take over all of Kamyansk and then from there build upon their efforts to take over Kamyshuvaka. So that's clearly one of the longer-term targets for the Russians. And that sort of implies that the Russians are looking to advance along the coastal routes just adjacent to, what remains the vestiges of the Dnieper River after, all of the water dissipated. So you have over here an advance along the highway. And it is important to note that this section over here, and I want to see how much, how wide it is actually. You can see that it amounts to 6.5 kilometers. It's a span of territory that does not have as many trenches. And as many layers as the areas east of it. So that gives an opportunity for the Russians to bank on the E-105 and cross through with less resistance, albeit they would have to fight through populated areas. That's the drawdown. They have to fight through, you know, areas that they may not have had to push through if they just advanced through an open field, for instance. But the difference is they don't have to fight through a trench. They would have to fight through houses and clear them out. So first Kamyanska, then Plavny, then Stepnohirsk, and then from there they have access to this large ridge, this ridge that sort of is sandwiched in between the vestiges of the Anchorkrak River, whatever remains of it, and the Konka River over here. And the bodies of water don't really matter; they're just floodplains at this point. But everything in between, these large spans of open fields that also include some key tree lines and roads, these areas would be important for the Russians to sort of build up as the operating base to then push into Komishuvacha. Perhaps instead of frontally attacking through this area over here that is very solid defensively, they would have to attack through Zaporizhzhia, cross over the road here, and then attack from the western flank. That's certainly a possibility. And this is all again speculation based on the idea that eventually the Russians will have aspirations in Zaporizhzhia, which I believe they will. But it would all have to begin through taking over Kamyansk and then advancing along that highway. And it probably would be easier to do along that route rather than a broader sort of assault that would occur perhaps through this open area that's sandwiched in between Kamyansk and Orkiv to then it directly pass through two layers or even more potentially of trenches to arrive at the southern entrance to the town. So that's what I could see playing out in that sort of scenario. But I think for now, the Russians are just trying to gauge the extent of Ukrainian defenses in certain areas and then using the resources available to them, which are increasing, but not at the desired pace for a major offensive. And then from there, they'll have the opportunity to sort of exploit whatever gaps they found in the Ukrainian line. And that's what I think, by the way, happened in Kamyansk. And now they're going to double down on it because they've sensed that there is a weak point over there. So moving to the east, we want to look at what's going on in southern Donetsk. So over here, the Russian forces have closed finally after over a week, maybe a week and a half of Ukraine's small squads continuing to cling on to whatever sort of positional area they could resist in, wherever they weren't spotted by the Russians or weren't sufficiently pressured. Now they've been fully evaporated from this location. Whatever forces were able to get out withdrew across the Mokryali River over the past 2 days. And the forces that were unable to, I don't think they were taken as POWs because there was no reporting on that. So it's probably just a small amount that were killed on the way out. And so the ones that did get out, they likely sort of situated around Myrny. And then from there, as with most of the Ukrainian forces deployed over here, moved westwards several kilometers to the border region between what we have now, Donetsk and Dnipro. So the Vavcha River is sort of acting as a separation point between the rear, where you have Havrlivka, Ivanivka, and also Veli Komichalivka, and then areas that are much closer to the front line are experiencing on a daily basis heavy bombardment and also advances. So due to the pocket closing, the Russians have captured a whopping 32.6 square kilometers of territory. And again, this is a culmination of a lot of efforts by the Russians to sort of squeeze out the Ukrainian forces rather than clearing out each individual plot of land through direct assaults. And in that regard, has been successful. And it was precipitated by the crossing of the river and capturing Pidubny, which we now know to be the case because on July 6th, the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade, they captured Pidubny. They claimed that they were able to clear 430 buildings or houses in this area. And they also claimed to have destroyed a company-sized formation, which, again, it seems on the higher end. A company can span from 100 to 250 individuals, but I've seen now numerous times this same brigade has been involved in raids alone. They've been the only force involved, taking over a small hamlet in pretty quick succession, and then claiming that they were able to destroy a company-sized formation or two platoons, and a platoon that could be 20 to 50. So that's more realistic. And then a company size would be 100 to 250. And then if that's the case, then it would definitely be on the lower end, closer to 100. But the formations that were involved, they claim, are the 37th Marine and 141st Mechanized Brigades. So we know for sure that the 141st Brigade is active around here. We've been plotting that for a very long time. 37th Brigade, they've actually recently been active a bit further northwards near Dakhny, and we're going to get into that. But it's not too far fetched for like a battalion to be deployed a bit further southwest, and then another battalion to be fighting near the border with Dnipro. That's certainly possible, and I actually think that's the case with a lot of these units over here, where they're not just concentrated with their entire headquarters in one area. They are sort of spread out across a couple of kilometers, but all in all, it's the same sector. So I also have them marked over here on the map, and I did add in, I believe, the 5th Heavy Mechanized Brigade recently. And now it's been confirmed this unit is operating around here based on a video from July 7th of the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Brigade. And this is to be distinguished from the 5th Assault Brigade, which is a different unit. This is a heavy mechanized unit. Used to be a tank brigade, but now because it's adding in infantry formations, it's no longer going to be just a tank brigade. So they fired on houses in Tolstoy, and this gave us an indication that the Russians have already expanded out of Pidubny and are taking the opportunity to just clear out all these hamlets on the western side of the river. And the Ukrainians simply have not displayed the ability to cohesively organize and put a stop to these advances, find an area where they could actually stabilize the line. Their hope was that it would be the Mokryali River, but clearly, due to that penetration that caught them by surprise, they now have an outlet to expand, and they're going to continue expanding because at this point, there's no way the Ukrainians are actually situated on this side of the river. The Russians will have the ability to push from Zorka and Yalta and cross over to Kryshivska. And they don't even have to do that. They can just continue from their current advance west of the river and reach that hamlet. Either way, it's extremely exposed, and so is Tolstoy for that matter. So for now, we don't know whether the entirety of the village has been captured because we know that the Russians entered, they have infantry there, but the Ukrainians, they did show footage of a tank entering into the village and firing onto individual houses. So clearly they've moved in one of their higher caliber forces to try to put a stop to this. So we'll have to see if the Russians are successful at further expanding, because at that point, Kharkivska is just a matter of time, and so Novohadska. And the focus would be on Zeleny High, because Zeleny High acts right now as a vanguard for Ivanivka. The loss of Zeleny High opens up the road across the river to enter into Ivanivka, or at least put some sort of frontal pressure on it. So it's very important for the Ukrainians to ensure that the fighting doesn't get relegated to Zeleny High, and if it does, that it stays there. And same thing has to go for Andrivka Klevtsove to prevent any sort of crossing of the highway over here. And you do have right now this open space in between the, what is this, 4 square kilometers of territory captured between Pidubny and Tolstoy. And let's see how far away it is. It's about 7 kilometers. So it is a long track, but it is completely open. Besides this, it basically runs parallel this anti-tank ditch. It wouldn't really do anything. So you have an open road. Drone crews are obviously going to be active and disincentivize heavy mechanized attacks. But you can see potential for motorcyclists in smaller groups to try to infiltrate and try to already get a foothold over here. So that's something that the Ukrainians will have to prepare for. And the bridge that is connecting between each side was actually bombed by the Russians recently. And so I believe that the span was destroyed over there. So they'll have to work on setting up a pontoon. But honestly, they might actually be able to cross over by themselves, just like swimming or on foot. I don't know. So, looking at Dakhny, you can see that the Russian forces have captured, or rather the Ukrainians, I apologize, 2.1 square kilometers of territory. They were able to reverse the original geolocation, which was actually recorded near the same house. So that's crazy. This is from June 30th. It's a video of the 114th Motorized Rifle Brigade. They were able to storm the village rather quickly and take it over. But now the 37th Marine Brigade re-entered and were able to push even deeper further eastwards. But I would not say that the entirety of the village is under their control, because the video is recorded on the western edge. So they draped their brigade's flag, and that gave us an indication that they're trying to do everything to relegate the fighting to here, try to create a stabilization measure, taking advantage of the trench networks, of the river, of the long route that it takes to arrive from Bakhatir to Oleksivka all the way to this new part of the front line, in order to just complicate matters. Because the Ukrainians would far prefer that the fighting gets dragged out over here, rather than the Russians just continuing to rapidly push northwards and immediately arriving at an area like Novopavlivka. And as long as the fighting sort of stays around Dakhny, the Russians can't really use this highway to attack northwards. They would have to focus on attacking from the east until that changes. So that's why the 37th Marine Brigade is involved in those counterattacks, and we'll see how long they can hold on. Also, now Ukrainian sources finally admit that the entirety of Zeleny Kut and Novokrainka have been taken. So this is about 44 hectares of territory. We're still waiting on the final sections of Oleksivka. They may still be under Ukrainian control or a gray zone. We're not sure yet. There's also this entire network of trenches located on ridges that remain under the hands of the Ukrainians and act as a vanguard, preventing attack coming from the south to overrun the remnants of the salient. And with the attacks on Dakhny, the salient over here becomes even more important because you don't want to have a situation where this bulge, so to speak, is completely swallowed up by the Russians, and they have a much stronger basis through which to attack towards the Ukrainian defenses in Dakhny itself. So that's going to be a part of Ukraine's calculus, continuing to send small groups to holdouts along this line and then sending in drone crews to attack any Russian infantry that are spotted out in the open, trying to make a move on those open fields. Now let's finish off with Pokrovsk because we do have some important updates from here. First of all, we now know that the 16th National Guard Artillery Brigade is operating here. I was not aware of their existence, but I just added them to the map. They're involved in suppressive fire, including using D-30 howitzers to fire towards Russian positions in Urozhaine, I believe it was. Or my apologies, it was actually the 91st Anti-Tank Battalion that was involved in that specific maneuver, but they may have done so in collaboration with the 16th Brigade. But in any case, what I want to zoom in on over here is the fact that the Russians have already entered in and taken over the southern chunk of this hamlet. So we talked about this in earlier videos, not in the most recent one because we didn't have any movement over there. But over the past 2 weeks, we've been looking at Rosina and saying that this is a potential weak point for the Ukrainian side because it's true that there are two layers of defenses that are well built directly west of Rosina. You can see them over here and also running south of Fedorivka. But Rosina itself is not difficult to overrun. It's an extremely small hamlet, and we've already had a track record of the Russian forces. Once they step into such a small sized area, they're able to take it over. They're able to seep themselves into the basements. So now we're seeing that with the 91st Anti-Tank Battalion conducting fiber optic FPV strikes and also using D-30s to strike the Russian troop accumulations in the village. This is from July 5th, and so there's been now 2 days for the Russians to likely expand deeper into this area. And this unit, this 91st Anti-Tank Battalion, that on its own is not going to be sufficient to conduct a counterattack. They're most involved in like inflicting damage to Russian forces and inflicting casualties. So that's going to have to come from one of the other units deployed over here, like the 38th Marine Brigade, maybe Scala. They're also deployed around here. There are a lot of ground forces like the 1st Assault Regiment, Da Vinci Wolves. And obviously, you look a bit southwards, you have the 14th National Guard Brigade, 153rd Mechanized Brigade, but they're also caught up with the developments in Novoekonomichny and Mykolaievka. So we'll get to that in a moment. But besides entering into the village, the Russians are also making a move to completely render it impossible for the Ukrainians to remain in these two salients. So the Russians understood that these two are large chunks of territory, and it's possible to overrun them directly. But that gives the Ukrainians further time to build up their defenses in areas on the rear that are actually the ultimate goal rather than the open fields. And it just bogs down the Russians. It's sometimes not the best case. Sometimes it's just better to avoid direct confrontations with these open fields and try to nearly encircle them, create a cauldron, and then squeeze out whatever remnants remain. So that's what we're seeing here with these two salients. It's going to be extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to remain in these salients, and they're going to be squeezed out eventually, which will mean that the front line sort of coalesces around the entrance to these villages, meaning the Russians will have a very solid front line, and they do have roads leading into these areas, like the T-0504 over here. So from there, they can just continue putting pressure on Mykolaievka. We can already see the Russians captured 2.5 square kilometers of territory going into Mykolaievka. The video from the 91st Battalion shows FPV strikes on one tank and 2 infantry fighting vehicles. So this is an area where they are lenient and are willing to use their armored vehicle arsenal because there obviously is a heightened importance to establishing control over a sort of deep penetration area where there are actually active Ukrainian infantrymen using more protected sorts of vehicles that are larger in size, more bulky, have more protection on the sides and on top. So that's the logic behind it. So as a result, they've been able to push, let's see the extent, about 2.6 kilometers northwestwards. And that means that Mykolaiv is currently contested. You do have this area to the east, which is beginning to get isolated. The width of this pocket is only 1.3 kilometers, which is going to be difficult to retain. And the Russians have almost arrived at the highway over here. And from there, they would actually get to the heart of Novoekonomichny, which is a rather large village compared to the other ones around here. I mean, along the Tresk River line, obviously, because after that point, you cross over the river and you arrive at the large cities like Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk. And a part of Ukraine's defensive strategy was building up these layers of defense. So the Russians would first have to overrun villages, and in the process, have some sort of attrition, and it takes time to actually clear out the houses. And then from there, they would have to overrun another two lines of trenches. By effectively taking over Mykolaiv and Novoekonomichny, they can also circumvent this line over here, although I'm sort of skeptical of its efficacy at this point. I would say that this line, though, is going to be rather formidable because it's the one that's sort of immediately to the east of Myrnohrad, and the Ukrainians would prefer that the fighting never actually reaches into that city, given its important status right now. But you can see as the bottom line that they're trying to create this correction on the front line to get rid of these salients. They're trying to infiltrate directly in to these populated areas, this line of towns that spans from Urozhaine all the way to Mykolaiv, and they're doing so in a two-pronged maneuver, one from the northeast from Kopcheve, one from the southeast from Myrlyubivka, which is why that was so important, and I continued reiterating that over the past couple of months. The capture of Myrlyubivka unlocked a lot of possibilities for the Russian side over here. So what we're seeing as a consequence is that the entire Turets line is going to be overrun. Turets line is on low elevation, so the Ukrainians are not losing when it comes to the elevation sort of conversation. They have a lot of massive ridges that are directly to the west of Myrnohrad. You can see them over here. And the same goes for the Russians. They have control over this large chunk of territory between the highway and the trenches over here, located on a rather high elevation. But they're sandwiched in between this low-lying valley, which the Russians will take over, and then from there they have to fight uphill. But they will have near immediate access to overrunning the slag heap and a couple of other ones over here that will give them amazing vantage points for the road leading into Pokrovsk and also for the cities themselves. So it's about the Russians utilizing the crossing of the river, the crossing of the villages, the crossing of the first defense line as a building block to overrun the entirety of this northern ridge, this high elevated area that protects these two cities that are currently the bulwark of Ukraine's defensive efforts in Donetsk. Because the bigger picture is that losing this area, and it's not going to happen for a while, but we could already see the course that it's taking with this Russian pressure coming in from the northeast, would be to then have the focus, the center of gravity for the Ukrainians shift to Dobropilya, which is further northwards. If we're measuring, I think it's like 30, it's actually 20 kilometers north of Pokrovsk. And at the same time, if we're going to zoom in on a more granular advance, south of Popy Vyar, the Russians captured 1.9 square kilometers of territory. You do have this paved road that then branches out northwestwards. And you do have a line over here. It is still a part of the Turets River, which connects a couple of moderately large villages. And they're all, again, as I said before, linked together by the road, the paved road, and the low-lying river or valley. So it gives the Russians access to a whole line that can be overrun. Besides this one trench over here, this one line, they don't actually have that many defenses further westwards. So this is an area that can be exploited, but it is a bit further disattached. It's not really attached to what's really going on in Pokrovsk right now, but it could still be important for two reasons. And this is looking more long term. This is not immediately related to the developments trying to sort of shape the battlefield for Pokrovsk. It would help shape the battlefield for Konstantinivka, for instance, by getting solid control over the ridge over here that overlooks the city. That's one thing. It would also set up the stage for later on attacking Druzhkivka. That would have to happen probably sometime in 2026. And then looking westwards over here at Dobropilya, it would sort of set the stage for pushing eastwards along this paved road to enter into Dobropilya yet again, probably sometime in 2026. That would be the hope for the Russians. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.